Welcome to The Pilot Life, the show where we sit down with people who are passionate about aviation. My name is Brendan. I've been a commercial airline pilot for over 20 years, and in that time, I've heard some incredible stories. This is the show that I share those with you. Welcome on board. Well, everyone, we are in for a treat today because sitting across from me is none other than Captain Chuck Spaeth. Chuck hired with Alaska Airlines in 1961 and retired in
98.
1998. 1998.
May 12th, 61 to September 98, yeah.
Well, I think this could go several different ways because I'm sure that you have stories upon stories. So what I'd like to do is maybe go back to the beginning. Okay, we're talking pre-Alaska Airlines. What was your life like as a youngster growing up, and where did this kind of spark for aviation come from?
So I was a farm kid on a tractor, and my tractor was a 1926 International hand crank at 12 years old and up. So working a piece of equipment was in my blood, and trying to do it without anything is really what we did. And I liked mechanics. Auto mechanics is the only thing I did well in school. Most of it was C's and D's.
Yeah.
Nobody really cared whether you went to school. If you were there to throw hay bales and milk cows, everything's cool.
And this was in what year?
That was I graduated from high school in 56.
Okay.
Yeah. Tough as nails, hard as bricks, the Chapman class of 56. Yeah. And so anyway, I graduated from high school in the morning and went commercial baling hay that afternoon, and went commercial baling hay for about 2 months while I was waiting to go to boot camp. So boot camp in the Navy was the best vacation I'd ever been on. And you could sleep in the morning until 5 o'clock or so. And the chief, he didn't know how to chew you out. My dad knows how to chew you out, so that was all cool.
Had you been exposed to any type of aviation at all prior to this?
No, and my dream at high school was auto mechanics and going to have a speed shop someday, some hot engine shop. When I went through boot camp, I had to wait a while before I got started in my schools. I was out at North Island in San Diego.
Okay.
I immediately loved what I was doing, guiding airplanes in and just line work. And the airplanes were, a British Lancaster came in one time. I mean, I can still hear those engines run on a British Lancaster, the old Rolls engine. Man, beautiful.
What was the airline scene like then, back in the late 50s? What were the big airlines?
The big airlines were TWA, Pan Am. Mm-hmm. Pan Am was the top dog stuff.
Right.
Eastern, Piedmont, and all them. There were a bunch of little guys. United, of course, was a big deal.
Sure.
And
American was probably.
Yeah. I'm a Kansas farm kid that never really studied, so I know nothing.
Right.
I mean, yes, I can make it go with a rock and a stick, but do I know? No. I'm just, wow. And so the Navy schools might wind up going to Norman, Oklahoma. Holy cats. The mathematics they taught you had to do with leading to how to figure out the cubic inch displacement of an engine. Cool. So then that was a preliminary, and then went down to advanced school at Memphis, Tennessee. They taught you about magnetos, magnetic field. Whew. Only I never knew how that magneto made current. Now, I was dumb enough to hold on to the spark plug wire and have them crank the magneto for me. They were looking for a sucker, and I did that, and I learned how much voltage there is in a spark plug wire and a magneto. Anyway, all of a sudden I'm done with 4 years, and I got out when I was 21. In night school, I had got my power plant license, so now I got a power plant license, and I tried to get a job with the airlines with power plant. Well, they wanted you to have an airframe and power plant license. I tried working in an engine overhaul, and I took out and went to Spartan School Aeronautics to get my airframe license to go along with the power plant license. And so while I'm there, of course, I'm rapidly getting more poverty-stricken, and Nellie Honeycutt had a garage out in her backyard that she'd converted into an apartment that had a roll-away bed and a little sink and a toilet.
Did you say that her name was Nellie Honeycutt?
Yes. And she matched the name. She was a card reader and a seance.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
I bet that the rent was cheap, though, was it?
I can't remember. My brother came down. I had a 39 Chevy Coupe that I'd bought, and he turns a corner in front of somebody and munched the fender in. And
so you're working on your airframe license? Is that what you're doing here?
And airframe license, and then at the end of the airframe license, I got that, and there was a multi-engine maintenance mechanic school. Well, obviously, I like big airplanes. Bigger is always better, and so I said, well, I'll take that school, and that 4-month school was on Super Connies. So at the end of the 4 months of school, which is actually the ground school for being a flight engineer. Now, in those days, it was right at the beginning of thinking about a professional or a pilot, I should say a pilot engineer. Professional engineers were in the process of having a war with Airline Pilots Association, and the Airline Pilots Association wanted to get rid of the FEIA. Of course, I was too innocent to know any of that stuff, and so I got this ground school right at the end of it. If I could come up with $2,000, I could take the flight training. Flight training was $1,286. Now, I'm 85 years old, and I still remember it was $1,286, not $87. And, wow. So I talked to my old banker. I used to have $15 or so on pig money or whatever. Raised some pigs when I was on the farm. In the mail comes $2,000. Well, I thought the banker decided that they could make the loan. Miami Airways was doing the in-flight training. Miami Airways was a non-sched of the bottom of the barrel non-sched. They had some C-46s, a couple of old 749 Connies.
Yeah.
And so Dave Booth and I were the two students, and another guy was supposed to show up. Anyway, we go down to San Antonio, hitchhike down to San Antonio, and I don't know how he got. Anyway, we get down there and lucked out. Found another little old lady, had twin beds in a room, and he was poor. He needed to come watch his nickels. So we teamed up, and we're waiting for the captain to come or somebody to come. And we had a little week of ground school on their procedures. This captain comes up with a big Cadillac, takes us to the airport at San Antonio, Texas. And we go out there, and wow, this is pretty exciting. And there's this 749 Connie sitting out there, a little oil dripping off of it every place. But a bunch of poor soldiers in there that had no idea what they were riding on. And so the crew gets out, and they talk about that their paycheck had bounced. Well, the captain gives the other captain a check. He says, go in there and have a cup of coffee while we get started and get out of here for the gas. There's no money in the bank. So hide out until we lift off, and then give them the money and go. Of course, it's over-the-wing fueling, so you're walking around out on the flight engineer runs the nozzle, they throw a rope up, and the hose comes up to you. My first start of the first two engines, 3 and 4, man, I got them started and smoke's going and a typical Connie light off. Here's the airport manager running across the ramp. Of course, in those days, there weren't any big jetways and all that fancy stuff. And so now there's about probably 50 poor little PFCs or boot campers in the back, hotter than heck.
Yeah.
So the guy comes up, and there's a crew entrance door up by the cockpit that raises up. So the airport manager comes in with the check. He says, I called the bank. There's no money in the bank. So there's all kinds of profanity. And, okay, I'll just chain the airplane up when you get to New York. Well, we go to New York, but in the meantime, Miami Airways came up with a little money and paid him off, and the things were going good. So we made it there and made it to Chicago. And, no insurance for going further on the airplane. Well, the other Connie comes into town, the other 749. Bob Taylor, big burly Bob, he's getting kind of attached to Dave Booth and I. We're kind of his little kids. He said, Chuck, he says, you go out and pre-flight the airplane, make sure that all the items on the logbook are taken care of. Of course, I got my A&E license and stuff. He says, I'll pick up your hotel bill. Bingo. So, wow, I'm out there. He picks up the hotel bill. I get out of town. So now we go to Oklahoma, and a flap carriage broke and punched some metal underneath the wing.
Wow.
So we had to ferry to Burbank. So we ferried to Burbank. Get that fixed. They had another load out of San Diego, but we didn't have any money for fuel. But they had a little fuel left when they landed. So we fly down to San Diego, and this is a common carriage, they called it. I've never heard of it before or after, but some airline couldn't fly to Chicago, so they hired Miami Airways to fly this group of people there. And so it was all, credit cards weren't a big deal. It was mostly checks and money. There's the crew out there in the airplane sorting out money. And, well, Bob Taylor comes out on the wing and says, Chuck, put an extra 50 gallons in each main. They aren't putting enough fuel on. Well, they're trying to get some money. And so anyway, I do that. So now then we're all fueled up, and here comes the gas man. We're all ready to start engines, and he comes up in the cockpit with the fuel. And the captain looks at it, and, oh, there's 200 gallons too much fuel that he's got to pay for. And so the profanity goes again, but his fuel's already, let's go. So
it's already on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we get to Chicago, but we have all the crossfeeds open. The boost pump's on low. You don't want them on high because it'll push the fuel away from the, you want them on low. And gently turning the airplane, but we had good weather. We made it in there, but now they're broke. Another paycheck's bounced.
Yeah.
So I get out my thumb and call the school, and they send me a couple $100. Go to the school for a month, and now it's time to go to the airplane and get a check ride or get some training. The DC-6 will require some more time and kind of start all. So he says you'll need the $1,286. I said, oh, no. I said I didn't have $100. Well, he says you got about $500 left. I said I don't have $100. And I said just get me a job, mechanic's job with an airline. This has gone far enough. He says, I got another idea. Come in the morning. So I show up in the morning. He says they went for it. He said, I told him I had one guy that went through this bankruptcy, and he's only got $500 left, and what can you do? They said they'd take me for that price. It's Alaska Airlines up in Seattle. He says, they got a pretty good financial page. He says, I think it'll be a pretty good deal. So now it's just a matter of getting to Seattle.
Right.
A little hitchhiking to Denver, and then it got cold, so my sister worked for United, so she got me up to Seattle cheap.
Had you ever heard of that airline?
Alaska Airlines?
Yeah.
Heavens, no.
Yeah.
No, nothing. No idea of anything.
You're just looking for a job.
Well, what I was going for was the in-flight training for being a flight engineer, but now on a DC-6 instead of the Super Constellation.
Okay.
And so I get there, and they got a little old slipshod building down on 4th and Wall in downtown Seattle for a training center. And they had some little classrooms up. It was upstairs in an old beater building. And So I go in there and meet some of the people. And so right away, they get us hucklebuck, and they did have the DC-6s running Sail Anchorage Fairbanks back down. So that began to look good. An old brick building that had a bunch of old people like me over there in it, a retiree building. Of course, the World's Fair is in the thought process now. That's in 60. And
so this is
1960 when I showed up in
1960.
Seattle.
Okay.
Yeah. And so now it's just a matter of getting an airplane and going out, flying around, and learning how to do stuff in the airplane.
So what position were you actually hired into?
Okay, I finished up and got my flight engineer rating, and that went fairly quick. There was myself, and there were two other new recruits, you might say.
So Alaska hired you without your flight engineer ticket?
Not yet. They hadn't hired me yet.
Oh, they offered to help you finish up?
My $500.
You had to pay.
My two buddies paid $1,286 for their flight engineer license.
I see.
I didn't have a pilot license. Now, I had maintenance background from the Navy, so that put me up above Dick Forte, who basically just had a little flight engineer. So they said, well, we need some pilots, and would you like to be a pilot? I said, well, I'd love it, but I don't have any pilot time. I haven't flown a Cessna. And
I'm just trying to get this straight because this is so crazy to me. So they hired you as a flight engineer on the DC-6.
Yeah.
But you didn't have a flight engineer ticket yet. You came, they were going to train you up and get you that with you and your $500.
Well, they waited with my $500. They waited until I had the ticket in my hand.
And then you had to pay them the $500.
They took that $500 was gone, and but I didn't have a pilot's license. But they said, that's okay. You can get your pilot's license on probation. You got 1 year of probation.
Right. So when they offered you this pilot position, if you get your license within a year, are they offering to pay for your flight training, or is that something that you have to do on the side?
Yeah. No, you're paying it right out of your pocket.
So you have to go on the side and find an airplane and an instructor to get your, is it a private license or?
A commercial and instrument. And
wow.
1 year to get a commercial and instrument, have it or boom, out the door.
Wow.
So I called the banker, because if I pay the banker back, he loaned me $2,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I got to pay him back. Oh, I can't pay him. But if I pay him back, then I won't have a commercial and instrument. I'll get fired at the end of my first year.
Right.
So I called the banker. He says, Chuck, he says, when you can, pay me back, okay?
Yeah.
So, man, skated another one.
So the airline, when you got hired, they had the DC-6?
They had the DC-6.
What else?
And they had some DC-4s.
Okay.
And they had a Twin Beach up in Fairbanks, and it was the last of the Bush. The Twin Beach was the last of the Bush. And Sig Krogstad, who wound up being a Unalakleet airport manager, awesome guy, but his flying, he flew VFR to the Willits, just VFR to the Willits. He didn't fly any instruments. Well, of course, I'm trying to get my instrument commercial.
Yeah.
And we had a link trainer up in this little building downtown. And, of course, I lived next door in the brick house.
Yeah.
And, so anyway, I would go over, and Dick Whitting tried to teach me instruments, but then things went good enough that he taught me how to run the bug on the table, get it all set up, and have range approaches or whatever, and I'd crawl into the little link trainer, close the lid down, and I'd fly and do approaches and everything and fly instruments in that. And when I get out, shut it down.
Yeah, so the link trainer was one of the first flight simulators used. And it was a small little box that you would crawl into and then fold the lid over yourself, right?
Yeah.
So he showed you how to set it up at the instructor station, and then he would leave, and you'd get it set up.
It was just a regular office desk, and this little bug would crawl around on the office desk wherever you'd fly the airplane. low frequency range or
Wow.
NDB.
Yeah.
So then you could do all of that, and the bug would leave a little ink trail where it went, so you could tell.
So that's what you use for your instrument training. What did you use for your flight training?
A 172, Cessna 172.
Where at?
Boeing Field.
Okay.
Galvin Flying Service.
Yeah.
You've probably heard of Galvin.
Yeah.
Of course, whenever I wasn't flying as a flight engineer, now the initial flying was 101-100, and so that 101-100 was Seattle, Anchorage, wait a minute, no. It was Seattle, Fairbanks, Anchorage, then you'd overnight, and then you go Anchorage, Fairbanks, Seattle, because of course, the DC-6 is slow.
Yeah.
And so you'd have to have overnight up in Anchorage. And the pilots had an apartment they rented up there that the flight engineer gets a couch. There's 2 bedrooms and a couch. Yeah, but it was good. And then in the meantime, then I'm beginning to get this commercial instrument down at Boeing Field with, and Ted Garlitz. He was really cool because when I had a day off, I would schedule, say, 2 hours of flight time in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon, and then so my proficiency was jumping up pretty quick. Like there wasn't any new learning. You were all of a sudden they come up with a Convair 880. Now, this is my old buddy Charlie Willis, Charles F. Willis, which in all due respect, he's a very decorated World War II pilot, married to a Firestone daughter. He was a real aviator himself. He flew a P-51. Nicely, the Alaska Airlines maintenance, while we're going broke, is maintaining his P-51 and a Navy trainer, a biplane. The only thing is, okay, my dad, when we were working, he always worked longer than I did, so you could have respect. Charlie Willis, I mean, he's out there flying a P-51. He's no slacker,
Yeah.
This 880 comes up, and holy cats, man, that makes us kind of competitive because now jets are beginning to be a real world. Pacific Northern Airlines, well, our 101-100 was a nice run, but when the 880 showed up, it could do all the work, all the DC-6s. So now the DC-6s are going to be gone, and they'll have one airplane.
Right. So just to provide some historical context, 1961, still heavily into a regulated airline system.
Yes.
And so airlines were gifted certain routes, right?
Yes.
And obviously the bigger the airline, the better the more people you knew, maybe the better off you were. But if you got contracts, that wasn't covered under this, right? So you could bid on whatever contracts you wanted.
And
so the 880, the Convair, had Alaska looked at the Boeing 707?
no money.
It was expensive.
Alaska had no money, and Convair had airplanes and nobody to take them. They had some, but Convair was a poor guy like us, so they wanted an airplane gone. Now, that was the big advertisement, 4 jets to Alaska. It won 2 on this wing and 2 on that wing, And that was literally,
Yeah, because the people competing with Alaska actually had four flights a day, right?
Yeah.
And so Alaska's way to counter that was to say, well, we have 4 jets going to...
Yeah, we got 4 jets.
Going between.
And that's where Willis was awesome, huh?
Yeah. You're on the DC-6
Yeah.
as a flight engineer.
Yes.
Right? And so the DC-6 gets sent where now?
To Tachikawa, Tokyo.
Okay. Gets sent over to Tokyo.
How do you get a DC-6 to Tokyo?
I don't know. How do you?
Well, there's not any fuel on this thing, and so you got to get this Shimya, ADAC, but the weather's lousy. But they were absolute fantastic GCA controllers out there, and they were good. They got you in, and then you'd pull out. But now you'd have to stop at Hokkaido Island up north at Misawa or Chitose to get fuel to get the rest of the way down to Tokyo.
What were you doing out there in Tokyo?
Flying freight to the military. And
Okay, so this was a military contract.
Military
that
contract.
Alaska had.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I went down and got a passport and lucked out and all this stuff. The engineer on the first trip didn't get his passport in time. And so I wound up taking his trip over to Tachikawa. And so then he took the next trip, and the next trip they landed short at Shimian. So that was one of our bad crashes that killed everybody. And
A DC-6?
yeah, a DC-6.
Wow.
It was just really, that just didn't fit, because
So you obviously got your pilot's license after that first year?
just
So-
barely. Yeah.
So you were able to stay on.
Yeah.
And then did you ever fly the DC-6, or were you only on the flight engineer position?
I was only a flight engineer, yeah.
Okay. So talk about your first flying airplane. Which one was that?
Well, my first real flying with Alaska was Bangkok, Thailand.
Okay.
Alaska Airlines.
I know.
Bangkok, Thailand. What? We're over in Bangkok, Thailand. Well, we've got an oil leak on number 2. Well, that steel pipe thing laying there is a cowling wrench for a Super Connie. The mechanics at Alaska,
Oh, you're talking about this.
yeah, that thing there. I carried that in my flight bag as a flight engineer with Alaska Airlines. One of the mechanics at Alaska Airlines made that for me because he knew that I was signing off dailies and doing.
Yeah.
We're out in Neverland.
I don't think you could carry this in your flight bag anymore.
I don't think.
What was this part for?
Okay, the soft part went against the prop spinner,
Oh.
and that spike went into the over-centered latch, and you push it in, and it clicks, plops out,
Oh.
and push it down in. So that was a neat piece of equipment. So I'm out there with that thing. I'm on probation. Now, wait a minute. It was a different world. So I get this cowling apart and get a couple of Air Force guys and some old, military ladders, and went up, and we luckily were able to fix the oil leak and button it back down. And I've got it all fixed, buttoned back up. Now, Bud's sitting at the flight engineer, and Gene Wheeler, the old World War II pilot, been shot down and stuff. He's over there in the co-pilot seat. And I'm kind of nervous because I'm still on probation. If Bud just gets out of my seat, we could start and go. Gene looks back. Well, sit down, Chuck. So I'm up there kind of sliding into the captain's seat and looking at Gene Wheeler saying, "But Gene, I don't have a pilot's license. I don't have anything, huh?" "Well," he says, "you can taxi this thing, can't you?" I said, "Yeah, I think I can." Now, that's a big deal, too. It's 42 feet, 6 inches between the outboard and main tires. So old Chuck makes the takeoff and flies it up to Tachikawa, going around out of Bangkok, Thailand, down around, Vietnam and up to Tachikawa. Of course, I gave myself credit for doing everything perfectly, and as we're getting ready to take off, he says, "Chuck, I can get this thing out of anything you can get it into. Don't worry about it." Wow. Wait a minute. 160 or 150-foot wingspan, 4 engines, 3,400 horsepower each, and this kid doesn't even have a pilot license?
So this was during your first year,
Yeah,
before you had finished up your commercial instrument.
right.
They just stick you in the left seat of this Connie.
Left seat of a Connie, and flew, I don't know how many hours, 6 hours, 5 hours.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
navigator and stuff. Anyway, so that was beginning to be a pilot. Oh, yeah, that's right. I got to finish getting to be a pilot, don't I? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so
That's pretty awesome.
Oh, it was just unbelievable. You couldn't touch me for a week, wow. Wheeler kept me from killing myself and that sort of stuff. So now then we wound up flying to Connie's all over Southeast Asia. I think that built up more as Vietnam started. Of course, the big boys in Washington, D.C., the Pentagon, they're sending Class A explosives over before they need them. So we were going through Hawaii, Wake, Guam, Philippines, and hauling a lot of Class A explosives and all that stuff. And we were flying the North Pacific too. Bruce Bond, he was a new flight engineer. Now, I was up to, 23 years old or something now, and old and salty, and a Czech flight engineer.
Yeah.
And so Bruce shows up, and he gets training as a flight engineer, and he's going to be the second engineer on the flight out of Charleston to Bermuda, to the Azores, to Tripoli, North Africa. We get to Bermuda, leave off a little bit of load, put on a bunch of fuel. Now then we leave out of Bermuda, and we'd put a little extra fuel on board, and we get over the Azores, and we got enough fuel. We'll go to Casablanca. I'm asleep in the bunk, and the navigator shakes me, and he says, Chuck, I think there's a problem up there. He says, you might want to go up with your other engineer, Bruce Bond. Bruce Bond, bless his heart, always looked really young, and he always smiled, and he always he was just a happy little guy. He had made a fuel report to Clark Cole, who Clark Cole was known for being vicious. I mean, he could really get mad. And so Clark all of a sudden is up there, and Bond hands him a fuel reading. We can't make Casablanca. We got to turn around and go back to the Azores. And with a smile on his face and a chuckle, he tells Clark Cole that he made a little 10,000-pound error. We're all right. We got plenty of fuel. I mean, the whole cockpit was in profanity up there. And, of course, this is tense times. You're doing it all yourself, and yeah. So anyway, we make it to Tripoli. We fuel that thing up empty to fly back to Baltimore nonstop. And the Connie holds 9,785 gallons of fuel with a 1649. And we'll go 26 hours with that fuel empty. Whew. Not a shortage of fuel. So that trip was 21 hours and 44 minutes. And by that time, the two captains weren't speaking to each other than gear up and gear down. And, oh, man, you talk about smoke rolling around.
21 hours, wow.
Yeah.
How would you guys pay for gas at airports that we didn't serve,
There were
check or
I was too poor to give any money. The captains did use their credit card, and the captains had done that previously back in the old DC-4 days. The pay scale wasn't that high, but then of course fuel was cheap.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I want to know about your first captain position. What was the first airplane that you were the captain on?
The C-130 Hercules. Yeah. I had just minimum time to having it type rating, and so I go up to Fairbanks and jump in this C-130, and of course, it's no simulator. It's just jump in the airplane and learn to fly. And so now the Herc was like a Connie with all kinds of performance and all modernized Connie. You move the controls. 727, it was a performer, and neat. So the Herc, I get checked out. Good. Now I R1, and I come down to Seattle, and Clark Cole the guy I mentioned that was tougher than a junkyard dog, was the chief pilot. Well, luckily, Clark and I got along. And so I come in and I say, Clark, I said, yeah, I'd like to fly with Harold Welch next month. Yeah, I said, I'd like to have Harold teach me how to stay alive. Now, I flew quite a bit as flight engineer with Harold Welch as the captain and co-pilot on the Connies, and there were several times when his little expertise was above and beyond. All of them were just incredible pilots, but I mean, Harold was a special guy.
What would he do?
He just knew what he was doing. Man, the one day we're in a Connie, we were out of fuel. We'd ran several approaches. ADAC went below minimums. We didn't have enough fuel to get to Cold Bay. And we'd done holding several times, and now we've only got enough fuel to land at Shimia. And so we're doing this approach into Shimia, and if we got enough to go around and make another one, we might, but we might not. So we're coming down there, and it's all GCA, on localizer, on glide slope, correct 2 degrees right, on localizer, on glide slope, going about 15 feet high. Increase your rate of descent slightly. You're 10 feet below glide slope. And
someone's just talking you down.
So he's talking you down. The GCA controllers at Shimia and ADAC were just the best of the best. And it was just that way. And you're approaching minimums. Should have the field in sight. You're now at minimums, should have the field in sight, or go around. You're on localizer, you're on glide slope, now you're 50 feet below minimums. Should have the runway in sight, on localizer, on glide slope. You're 50 feet above the field, should have the airport in sight. About that time, there's a flicker of light by Harold's side. Kirstein's on the right side. Are we on this side of the runway lights or on that side? Power is coming on a little bit.
Yeah.
And, we don't know which side to runway. And Kirstein sees a light flicker by his side. He just takes his foot and stuffs rudder in. The airplane goes, 3 or 5 degrees. Over, he stuffs rudder in, back. It hits the runway. We're in the runway. We didn't take out any runway lights anyway. But now, how far down the runway are you? Well, it's max reverse, max brakes. Just get her stopped. So we get stopped. Everybody's kind of tense. And we go in there. Nobody's saying anything. Everything's official. Checklists are all done. Da-da-da. So we go up to the chow hall, which is about a 2-mile drive up there. Anyway, we get up there, and all of us get the tin trays and go have our military food. And we're over at the table, and here comes my buddy Harold Welch. Harold is coming over there. Now, he's got that metal tray with food piled up on the metal tray, bumper to bumper. He sets his tray down. My stars, he says, an approach like that just ruins your appetite. I mean, everybody's just cracking up, We're finally got a little humor going and relaxing. But it was that stuff with Harold. 727 I'd had a couple of times when he just knew what he was doing. So now I want to fly with Harold for this month. And Clark Cole looks at me, he says, that's a good idea. Okay, so Harold shows up at dispatch. We're going to go fly the Herc. Hey, Chuck, congratulations. You hear you got hooked? Yeah, I'm flying with you, Harold. Huh? Yeah, I said, you got 30 days, Harold. 30 days to teach me how to stay alive. I'm not caring how you talk to me or what you do. Just tell me every secret you can tell me, because I'm going to need them all. We're going into the Arctic, and Yeah. So
How would you then, when you upgraded and then you got to be a more seasoned pilot, how would you take on that role with a newer first officer?
I would do the same thing Harold did to me. Okay, you're flying. What are you going to do? And that's what he did. Whether we were landing at Fairbanks, where it's a big airport, and you're going to make the ILS, you're going to go here, there. Okay, yeah, so that was pretty boring. But up there, right away, he says, what kind of approach are you going to make? I think we're going to Prudhoe Bay. Dead Horse and Prudhoe Bay are lined up. Doesn't make any. So anyway, I said, yeah, I'm going to go out and, go downwind, do a procedure turn, and come back in. ADF, all ADF, no fancy, no Bossies, no nothing like that at that time. The runway lights were pretty dim, and they were only runway lights, no approach lighting system out there. And he says, that's not what I do. I said, well, what would you do, Harold? He says, I'd go out and do my procedure. So I was coming in downwind at 400 feet, level off at 400 feet. Now you've got Aurora Borealis. You got no lights on the horizon. All you got is a strip of runway light that moves. You think it moves. So you do this non-precision turn. You're down there at 400 feet, and the landing lights, you can bring them out at any angle. So he says, you run them landing lights, so they're a nice 3-degree angle to the ground, put some light beam on the ground. He says, you want to come across downwind, because he says you want to check for caribou or moose on the runway and stuff, kind of look at the runway condition. But now you go out past the end, and you're at 400 feet. So now you're going to do an 80-260 and come back in with Aurora Borealis in the windshield and stuff. That's checking your instrument flying. And, of course, you're on approach flaps. Then you got to correct for the wind. If you got a crosswind, if you got 3 degrees, you do that correction in your turn. You begin to fly on some precision in a non-precision environment, but Harold's got it all under control. Now your approach light system is 55-gallon drums. They're painted half white and half black. In the winter, the black shows up. In the summer, the white shows up. So they take a truck out there every so often and shake the barrels. And so that's your approach lights. Well, you bring your landing lights along there, and now you're stuffed them down to full flaps, and you got yourself set up with about a 3-degree landing light profile. So the light beams going along over the barrels and comes up to the end of the runway. And now you just adjust the power so that the light beam doesn't go down the runway. You want it staying on that spot. Now the blowing snow shifts everything that's kind of wiggly. There's no real depth perception. And so you kind of flump on, but the Herc had big tires and was good. But I would say in less than a year, some outfit came out of Florida or someplace and came up there, and they landed short. They didn't have Harold teach them how to do it. And wow, it brought, and so that, all those kind of little tricks and things. And
did you ever think about leaving?
I got laid off and went down to Western. I flew for Western for about 6 months.
Okay.
FEIA strike with the pilots had won, so the flight engineers are out. And of course, the pilots at Western didn't like flight engineers. And now I might have had a commercial then. I went down there and went to work for them, and I mean, they just abused airplanes. They were mad at the company. They were mad at flight engineers. They were mad at everybody. And it was just an attitude. I'd rather be a poor guy up there with Alaska. And so I got recalled and I quit. the Western chief pilot said, I wish you well, but I guess if you're going to quit here and go to Alaska, he says, we really don't want you here. And I said, that's what I'm doing. So I go back. 6 months later, I get furloughed again. I got offered a job with Northwest Airlines, and I knew that was beautiful, except I kind of wanted to stay at Alaska. So I went over and flew for Lufthansa instead on a contract where I could make better money. And so then I was over there about a year and came back to Alaska. And Kennedy and Cosgrave really just cleaned up things. They wanted to get rid of the Hercs and get all this cleaned up and work on the schedule. They had the 727s, and so I wound up on the 707 720s. We bought some 720s from Western, and they said they're going to go through them and put them in really good shape. Bruce Kennedy didn't want airplanes broken down in Yakutat. He wants, so wow, all of a sudden, it isn't, can we put it together and get out of here? It was the way it was done. Really a whole new world, and the non-sked stuff dwindled out rapidly, and Interior Airways took over the Herc operation up there and that sort of thing. And Neil Burke was one of our pilots that was senior to me, and he stuck with Interior, and he got a number there. Yeah.
So it sounds like it started to run more like the conventional airline that you see out there.
Right.
Scheduled airline operations, less of this contract kind of flying.
Yeah. And so
where was the airline flying at this time? Were they going down into Phoenix yet? Had Phoenix and that whole area been opened up, or was it still just kind of the?
We kind of we began to get into Oregon and then slipped down to California pretty rapidly. Mm-hmm. And then we had a nice triangle down in California there where, it was Burbank, Ontario, Los Angeles, and we had a nice triangle there. And so Bruce Kennedy was sitting in the jump seat one day at Burbank. Bruce Kennedy and I got along really good. When there was a problem, when I thought there was a problem, I would call up, and I'm not one to wear a necktie often, but I would put on a sport coat and a necktie and go down and see my buddy Bruce Kennedy and sit down and say, hey, here's what I see. And he would sit there and tell me exactly why he was doing what he was doing. And it was really a beautiful thing, and a lot of respect. So anyway, he's sitting in the jump seat. He's going to ride a couple legs in the jump seat. He'd usually do that, the short ones. And I said, yeah, Bruce, when our old friend Whiskey Willis was running this thing, I said, I had a big aluminum suitcase. I never knew what I was going to do tomorrow. And I said, it was really exciting. I said, they just phone and ring and away we'd go. He says, well, Chuck, when I get back, I'll see what I can do. I said, no, Bruce, don't mind. I kind of like what.
Nice to have a schedule, isn't it?
Yeah. So that was real flying then. Yeah.
Sound like there was kind of this open door policy too with him, where you could go in and talk to him. Was that only you, or do you think that was any pilot?
Of course, back in the rough and tumble days, I was flight engineer, so I was kind of a secretary on the union thing, and then I was a union man at the time, and then Clark Cole left and went to being chief pilot, and so I inherited the top seat on the union, but we were still poor guys, and so I was sympathetic towards the airline being poor, and I ruffled some feathers in the pilots. I've always got along good with the pilots, but by the same token, hey, we're poor boys. We aren't united. We aren't big. So usually I'd present enough case that they didn't hate me too bad. And so from that, it probably made me more comfortable to call up and go in and talk.
Yeah.
And when I got out, I would talk to the guys in the cockpit and let them know that I'd been in talking to, well, you shouldn't do that. Well, he signs a check.
Yeah.
And so it was really good. And a very special relationship that you could have it, and both sides left happy. Yeah, yeah.
I was thinking of all the things that you've seen that have come out from 61 to 98. You saw ground proximity.
Yeah.
You saw TCAS.
DME.
DME. Yeah.
DME,
The
yeah.
GPS system.
I can still fly a VOR approach into Sitka and the 181 radial out over the water out there, and you're 1,500. And when you're coming in, you're down to 1,000 until you hit the VOR, and then you go down to 700 feet and out to 001 radial to 9 DME. And 9 Mile Rock is at 9 DME, and that's a rock with a rock behind it with a buoy. When the tide's in, you can't see the rock behind it. You only have the rock and the buoy when the tide's out. So you got to know your tide table. See, and now those.
Unreal.
Then you turn to 330 and fly to Middle Island. But as you're going along there towards Middle Island, up comes a little island right there, and you do an on pylon around there, and there's Battery Island out. Oh, there's the runway. There's some trees and stuff. You couldn't quite make the runway out at some of that until you get turned in there. The same way with a circling approach at night. If you came in and you could watch the buoys, the lighted buoys in the water, and kind of do an on pylon on them and come around by Glankin Island at 500 feet. If you were 500 feet, you identified Glankin Island in the dark. You were on glide slope, and then there's the runway, and
Yeah.
so you put some of that stuff in.
Sounds like you've done that a couple times.
Yeah, and used it.
Yeah.
Used it, yeah.
Yeah.
That was Harold Welch flying. See that little bit of stuff there? Yeah, and I'm not sure that those items, I might have designed some of that myself, but yeah, it was, yeah.
Did you fly the 737 too?
No.
Okay. So
I chickened out.
So you ended it on the MD-80?
Yeah, but I told myself, well, the last 5 years, Warren Perry was number one and I was number two, and so over on the MD-80 I was number one and he was number one on the, so anyway, and Warren Perry was just a very special friend of mine.
I think what is unique is it's such an incredible diversity, right, of experience, because I think a lot of the people out there maybe just know what they would consider the current airline.
Yeah.
Right? Just they flew a 737 for 30 years, right? But to come in the 60s, before the airline system was deregulated, and you had the DC-6s and the old Beach flying out in the bush, right? And then you see the jet age, come in, and you see Whiskey Willis and just all these incredible names that to be able to sit here and talk with you about it is a real privilege. So thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it. There it is.
You betcha.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it. Until next time.